Are you ready? Okay, I think we're going to get started now. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's really nice to be able to see you virtually. I'm Laura Hammond. I am the team leader of the Research and Evidence Facility, which is a research consortium funded by the EU Trust Fund for Africa. You may have seen us in various different sort of formats and fora. But today we're going to be talking about cross-border movements, and we're taking this opportunity in this webinar to hear from two authors of recently released reports by what we call the REF, the Research and Evidence Facility. One is by Farah Manji, which is on circular refugee returns between Kenya and Somalia. And the second is from Ngala, Chome, which is on borderland infrastructure and livelihoods, a review of implications for the development of formal border crossings in Mandera County in Kenya. And these two pieces form central kind of pillars of some of longer and other kinds of work we've been involved since our founding in 2016 in a range of different research activities involving borderlands. So we thought we could use these two recent reports as a jumping off point to a broader discussion around borderlands and the dynamics that we are seeing in the region now. And so in addition to hearing from Farah and Ngala, we've asked Kristina Svensson from, who is the country manager of the World Bank in Somalia, to also speak to us about some of the World Bank's really interesting work on borderlands right now. So let me, I'm going to hand it over to our speakers. First to say, Farah will go first. She is a Kenyan researcher whose work focuses on international development, forced displacement, and social justice. She's also a consultant for the World Bank's Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Group in Kenya. And she'll speak to us for about 10 minutes about her work. And then we'll hear from Ngala Chome, who is an independent researcher also based in Nairobi, who's recently finished a PhD from the University of Durham in the UK. And then we'll hear from Kristina, who I've just introduced already. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we'll have a really interesting discussion. Each speaker will go for about 10 minutes, and that should leave us plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So Farah, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for those opening remarks and the introduction. I hope you can all see my screen. So today I'll be sharing some key impressions that emerged from the report that I wrote for the REF on circular refugee returns between Kenya and Somalia. As we'll discuss further on in this webinar, it's not only refugees who make these movements back and forth between the two countries, but in terms of the scope of this rapid review that I conducted, here we examined a specific type of cross-border movement among a particular population within a forced displacement context. So in this context, circular refugee returns referred to a situation whereby previous Somali refugees who had repatriated back to Somalia come back to Kenya, which is their country of asylum, either as a planned strategy or as a coping mechanism. So the backdrop to this was the voluntary repatriation program for Somali refugees in Kenya, which was established by UNHCR and the governments of Kenya and Somalia. Refugees who are supported to return through this program are provided with core relief items as well as cash grants on both sides. In parallel to this assisted program, you also have other Somali refugees who have been returning to Somalia over the years without facilitation from UNHCR. And this is commonly referred to in the literature as spontaneous returns. Currently, Kenya hosts the largest number of Somali refugees, and the majority of them reside in Dadaab. So this research was really driven by the need to share perspectives of a range of stakeholders at a time when the asylum space in Kenya was tightening. Registration and asylum processes in Dadaab had been suspended, and they still are. So this has resulted in thousands of undocumented individuals in Dadaab. If we look at how significant these numbers are, at the time of research last year, official figures showed there were almost 16,000 undocumented individuals in Dadaab, and almost a quarter of these were Somali circular returnees. However, what we found is that it's important to note that these official statistics don't include those individuals who haven't come forward to the authorities upon their return. And there's also no data on the number of returnees, including from the urban areas in Kenya, who had spontaneously returned to Somalia, but who were back again in Kenya. So as part of this rapid review, we explored a number of research questions, which included what motivates refugees who return to Somalia to move back to Kenya? How do they make this journey? Was this the first time they've moved back to Kenya? What opportunities and challenges do returnees face in moving back? And what provisions are being made to respond to their needs? So as part of this research, we conducted a review of literature as well as in-person and phone interviews with key respondents in Nairobi, Dadaab, and Garissa. These included county government officials, staff from the Refugee Affairs Secretariat, Somali returnees to Kenya, refugee community leaders, as well as NGO and UNHCR staff. So in terms of the main findings of the drivers of circular movement, this research corroborated that assisted return to Somalia does not always mean an end to displacement, even when accompanied by reintegration assistance. The underlying reasons for these circular returns are to a large extent linked to the discussion around the sustainability of return to Somalia. For example, of the 4 returnees we interviewed, none stayed in Somalia for more than a year, with the longest duration being 8 months and the shortest 5 months. The reasons for circular returns also depend on the particular circumstances facing the returnee. These may include forced displacement as a result of ongoing insecurity, violence, as well as political instability in Somalia. Other reasons include a lack of public services, the costs of living, coupled with lower levels of humanitarian support. In our interviews, returnees and refugee leaders also spoke of unmet expectations in Somalia, with the conditions there being more difficult than in Kenya, and also being contrary to the information they said they received from UNHCR and partners. It also emerged that clan dynamics can make life more challenging for some returnees, and this appears to be a contributory factor for returns to Kenya. In addition to these reasons, there are also some refugees making circular movements for less negative reasons. And these include temporary visits to families across the border and to pursue economic interests. For example, one NGO respondent who we interviewed noted that those who go back and forth have interests and assets on both sides of the border. So in essence, these unassisted or spontaneous returns allow refugees who can afford to do so to test opportunities on both sides of the border while having the flexibility to return to Kenya as registered refugees. Circular returns are also associated with the dispersal of family members between Kenya and Somalia in order to maximize access to services and family well-being in the short to medium term, while they might undertake a more permanent return if they see conditions being more conducive at a later date. In our interviews, access to education in particular is seen as being of better quality in Kenya, and this has emerged as an important factor influencing returns. In terms of decision-making and mobility, what we found is that the journey across the Somalia-Kenya border is indeed risky, but it's not necessarily difficult to arrange given the availability of transportation and the relative proximity of Dadaab to the border. A female returnee who we interviewed, however, remarked that the journey by road from Kismayo to Doble and then on to Dadaab was expensive, and she had to pay her way through various checkpoints. Family linkages and community networks are also important in sharing information about conditions across the border and in facilitating movement. However, whether anyone who is dissatisfied with their conditions in Somalia can afford to make these circular movements requires further exploration. We've learned from previous research by the REF and others that following return to Somalia, there are cases of returnees becoming IDPs and experiencing secondary displacement. And for them, often their social networks are in displacement camps. So when their return packages run out, do they necessarily have the means to come back to Kenya? There are many groups who are making these circular movements, including men, women, youth, and children, as well as entire families, although disaggregated data is not available. These circular movements also attest to the strong familial and social connections across communities in both countries. And this is true for both, refugees as well as host communities. Young people are a key demographic when it comes to circular returns, with mobility influenced strongly by livelihood opportunities. An interview, for example, with a female returnee who went to Mogadishu in 2019 but returned to Dadaab has revealed that she has since traveled to Doble for a job interview. So therefore, those who are mobile and educated are able to undertake these circular movements in order to pursue opportunities on both sides. Interviews also revealed that circular returns can often be a contentious decision within families, leading to some children and adolescents returning to Kenya alone. As explained by one returnee, I came back to Kenya to finish school. I came alone and haven't seen my mother in 4 years. So when we think about returnees and circular returns, we must highlight that they are not a homogeneous group, and their experiences upon return to Kenya are varied, and it also depends on a number of factors, including their legal status in Kenya, their networks, as well as their income sources. Returnees who make the journey unassisted outside of the official voluntary repatriation program are often, not always, able to retain their refugee status. But on the other hand, Somali refugees who are assisted to return with UNHCR facilitation are required to give up their refugee status. This means that if they return to Kenya, they do so as undocumented individuals, and they're no longer eligible to receive food assistance or free education, for example. Without a refugee ID card, they also face challenges in obtaining movement passes, qualifying for incentive work, and accessing financial and government services. There are also obvious protection risks associated with a lack of documentation. So in this situation, we find that many unregistered returnees are seeking support such as shelter and food from relatives, clan or community members in the camps. However, in the context of funding shortfalls and reduced food rations, as is the case in Dadaab and elsewhere, those who have been providing support to them are also likely themselves to be constrained. As mentioned earlier, our research also highlighted cases of children returning to Kenya without their families, and their protection vulnerabilities are further exacerbated by their inability to access basic services without valid documentation. In terms of future intentions and looking forward, when asked what their future intentions were, the returnees interviewed provided varied responses, which very much reflected their particular circumstances as well as their experiences of return. One returnee, for example, who's a single mother who came back to Kenya because she was unable to secure a job in Mogadishu after 8 months, reflected on the importance of having an income for herself and her family, whether it's in Kenya or Somalia. However, another female returnee, who is a mother of 7, stated her reluctance to return to Somalia due to what she deems a better quality of life for her and her family in Kenya. Therefore, security considerations as well as education and livelihood opportunities appear to be crucial factors at play in this regard. And Kenya appears to still present some favorable opportunities despite the challenging asylum space. In addition, refugee youth may also be more reluctant to return to Somalia, given the formative years they've spent in Kenya, as well as their established ties. The future intentions of urban returnees may also include onward migration to other countries within the continent, as well as onward migration to Europe. Among these returnees, we found that there's a real fear of coming forward to the authorities in Kenya, and more research is required to understand the challenges and opportunities they face, and whether these are different for camp-based returnees. What our research has shown is that circular movements, split families, as well as staged returns are an important strategy for many refugees, and they will likely remain so going forward. So on that note, I'll end there. I look forward to the discussion later, but for now, I'll hand it over back to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farah. Perfectly clear and very well to time. So additional thanks for that. We're going to move right now further on to Ngala, who's going to tell us about his borderland work. research. Ngala, are you there?
Yes.
Perfect.
Hello,
Go ahead.
everyone. Yeah. Should I just go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep, guys, I've already introduced your report, so you can.
Very much. Yeah, I have to say, I'm sorry, I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll try to be very clear and also brief in the kind of points I want to make. One, I think what's important to state at the beginning of my presentation is that the Kenyan border between, the Kenya-Somalia border remains officially closed. I think it's important to state that. And that insecurity in this area has resulted, the insecurity in this area has resulted in the official relocation of the Kenya Immigration Department from, in particular, Mandera County to Ajir. And Mandera County, in particular, is where this study was conducted and also focused on. The main purpose of the study was to examine the impact of the development of formal border crossings on the economy of the Mandera Triangle. Here, talking about the cross-border area between Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. At the very far end, I refer to it as the most northeasterly corner of Kenya. And to explore the implications of potential developments to establish new formal crossing points from Kenya into Ethiopia and Somalia. Basically, what will be the implication of introducing formal border crossing points and improving the existing infrastructure to local livelihoods. So one way in which we tried to answer this question was to do an extensive review of cross-border experiences across Africa, in particular in the Horn of Africa. And this review revealed in three sets of important themes that are experienced in majority of the cross-border areas in Kenya, or what we call borderlands in Africa, and particular in the Horn of Africa. These themes, one important theme in the experience, which we shall discuss maybe in this presentation or in the plenary, is the idea of informality and procedural innovation, which seem to be very vital to borderland livelihoods. So I'm going to discuss that later. But also, what was found from the review is that borderland livelihoods seem to be shaped by the actions of multiple actors. We're talking about local administrators, we're talking about local traders, we're talking about clan elders, and such like individuals. It was also found that a culture of corruption, intimidation, and violence often persists at border crossings. And this was very important because we found that even in areas where official border crossing points have been introduced, this culture of corruption, intimidation, and violence usually continues to mark the kind of cross-border experiences there. So the research was led by a number of research questions, and the first one, of course, was, what are the implications of lessons from across Africa, and in particular the Horn of Africa, for the introduction of formal border crossings and development of border infrastructure in Mandera County? What will be the impacts with respect to livelihoods, cross-border movements, trade and local markets and security of expanding the capacity of existing informal border crossings or introducing new formal border crossing points at Mandera? And also, how do these impacts affect different stakeholders, including borderland communities, local and national government, local and national businesses, and civil society? How are these impacts moderated by different balances between physical infrastructure development, investments in staff capacity, and procedural innovation at border crossings? The research methodology was a combination of extensive desk review, where Gray and published literature from academic journals, government reports and policies, and reports and project information from NGOs and civil society organizations, regional bodies, and national organizations was also reviewed. This extensive desk-based review was also triangulated or confirmed with 10 key informant interviews conducted by me with NGO representatives, local business people, and local journalists working in Mandera County. We have to note that the major limitation, of course, during the conduct of this study was the ongoing restrictions imposed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a majority of these interviews were actually conducted via phone and online channels. So we're going to go right into the situation in Mandera itself and the kind of local context there. There's only one official border crossing point at Moyale on the about 1,830-kilometer border between Kenya and Ethiopia, and none on the officially closed 682-kilometer border between Kenya and Somalia. However, given these kind of official restrictions, cross-border livelihoods or cross-border movements seem to be very important to local livelihoods in Mandera. And this is because people on both sides of the border have been brought close together by their privileged access to the best, so I would say the best of both worlds, that is, to the imbalances in prices and in the provision of services and goods across borders, which is the result of the operation of different legal and regulatory environments. The everyday economic lives of residents of African borderlands and also in Mandera depend on the ability to cross the border relatively quickly and frequently. At the Mandera Triangle in particular, where both the Kenya-Ethiopia and Kenya-Somalia borders meet, Mandera County, Ethiopia's Dolo Ado Woreda, that is district, and the Gedo region of Somalia are all distant from the centers of authority, business, and trade in their own countries. All are actually marginal areas cut off from most of their respective countries by poor transport infrastructure. And this means that sourcing goods from Nairobi, Addis Ababa, or Mogadishu is far more expensive than obtaining them from just across the border. Now, this makes informal cross-border trade crucial to the livelihoods of local residents. The trade in the Mandera Triangle often includes consumer goods imported through Mogadishu into Kenya, livestock from the lower and middle Juba regions of southern Somalia into Mandera, camels from Mandera County sold in Dolo Ado and Gedo, often to be shipped to the Gulf, and cut from Kenya into Ethiopia and Somalia. Despite the official closure of the Kenya-Somalia border, commodities from Somalia have continued to find their way into Mandera. Foodstuffs and household items, including motor vehicles, arrive in Mandera from Somalia, while wheat, beans, natural herbs, and cement arrive from Ethiopia. The town of Mandera is also a transit zone for goods destined for Ethiopia from Somalia, such as tea leaves, sugar, processed products like biscuits, juice, and cooking oil. Goods from Mandera traded in Somalia include construction materials such as timber, metallic items, steel, iron, sheets, paint, etc. Thanks to this significant volume of informal cross-border trade, small towns and settlements have sprung up, especially along the Kenya-Somalia border in Mandera. Most of these towns and settlements are within walking distance from each other, and some, like Bulahawa and Mandera town itself, actually straddle the border, making it difficult to police cross-border movement. Residents on both sides of the border also make use of each other's social services, and I think this was also echoed in the first presentation, especially livestock markets, abattoirs, schools, hospitals, and airstrips. Thanks to the relatively more developed infrastructure in Mandera, which has the only tarmac road across the entire Mandera Triangle, people tend to move from Dolo Ado and Gedo region into Kenya so as to access markets, hospitals, and schools. Traders in Dolo Ado and Gedo use banking services available in Mandera County, for example. Hundreds of Ethiopian students and thousands of Somali students have been known to cross the border to Mandera and enroll in Kenyan schools. The fact that the Kenya-Ethiopia-Somalia border in the Mandera Triangle has long been prone to fragility, recurrent external shocks, humanitarian disasters, and drought, famine, and poverty makes these cross-border relationships extremely important for the survival and resilience of local residents. Almost all the Somali clans residing in Mandera County, Kenya, have kinship ties across the borders in Dolo Ado, Woreda in Ethiopia, and Gedo region in Somalia, which continues to make these cross-border relationships very, very important. for the livelihoods of local residents. But how does this happen? We found that procedural innovation is very crucial for the sustenance of these cross-border movements and these cross-border relationships. What we call in the report adaptation and flexibility. Informal cross-border trade and kinship networks, as I've mentioned, are very vital to the sustenance of local livelihoods in the Mandela Triangle. As we speak, residents continue to make use of official border crossings on the Kenya-Ethiopia border, in particular at Ramu and Malkamari, and usually for small-scale cross-border trade. However, the lack of formal regulations, which is a very dominant theme in Mandela, and the lack of guidelines and legal procedures on cross-border trade has pushed some residents into smuggling, that is illegal activities, not out of choice, but due to the lack of an enabling legal and policy environment that allows for small-scale cross-border trade to take place. This is what has necessitated the adoption of procedural innovation and adaptive strategies by border guards and local administrators, usually in agreement with influential local business people and clan elders. Other arrangements, including the sharing of livestock markets on the Kenya-Somalia border at Elwak and Mandera, joint vaccination of livestock and measures to tame cross-border clan conflict, such as a recent agreement to share pasture lands between the Godia clan in Mandera and the Marehan clan in Gedo, are also dependent on procedural innovation on the ground, where such informal pacts remain unsanctioned by national governments, but receive the unofficial blessing of the local administrators who work for or represent national governments in that borderland region. Generally, the lack of official border trade agreements between the countries in the Mandela Triangle, coupled with the official closure of the Kenya-Somalia border and the absence of functional regulatory authorities, that is agencies such as the Kenya Bureau of Standards and Immigration Department, in Mandera induces adaptive strategies on the part of local residents and administrative flexibility on the part of local administrators and border guards. Administrators and border guards often work with a host of entrepreneurial individuals in the area, especially livestock marketing agents, wholesale traders, and clan elders controlling grazing areas who, due to these, exercise a strong influence over the nature of labor migration, cross-border trade, clan conflict, and transhumance. So administrators often meet these individuals in their offices to discuss crucial aspects of informal cross-border trade, which markets to use, which overland transport routes to be used for transportation to urban centers and the rest of the country, and so on. It is also these same actors who are important when it comes to the resolution of interclan conflict, especially since conflict usually disrupts trade. However, this can paint a climate of mutual cooperation and positive relations, especially between local communities and administrators who are found in this borderland area. However, this is not always the case. While these cross-border innovations and arrangements, some of which are unofficial, have created multiple opportunities for residents, it is important to note that usually the experience of most people, sometimes at the hands of border guards, is not that positive. Whoever is allowed to cross the border is often a matter of discretion, exercised exclusively by border guards, and following this, border officials or guards may disregard some of these local arrangements at times, pushing residents to use unofficial border routes, or they may ask for bribes from people ferrying goods across the border. And sometimes they may even engage in violence. In conclusion, in many borderland zones, including Mandera, border officials are normally comfortable exercising a degree of flexibility depending on the circumstances and stated reason for travel. Border crossers at Mandera continue to be subjected to this unpredictable discretionary environment today, and reports of intimidation and violence are not difficult to come by. One way of addressing these challenges, driven especially by informality and the unpredictability and uncertainty that informality induces, is to formalize existing local arrangements, introduce formal border crossings, or improve the existing border infrastructure. So the report issues a number of recommendations that may lead towards introducing this formality and this predictability at Mandela.
Can you take one more minute to wrap up, and then we'll move on?
I think I'll stop there.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll discuss the rest in the question. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we can get into the recommendations in the discussion if you like. Thank you so much. That's really very helpful. I think clearly these two presentations taken together start to show the importance of borders as spaces for crossing, but also in the importance of mobility in people's lives and the necessity of being able to move in an unhindered way. It really underscores a lot of the resilience behind a lot of livelihoods. Let me turn now to Kristina, and who's going to speak to us a little bit about some of the work that the bank is involved in border areas. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Laura. And just to start with a big thank you to the two presenters. I found it extremely relevant and timely and very, very informative. I think Farah's presentation on the drivers of the circular movement is very, very interesting. And similarly, Ngala's report on the challenges at the border and the trade at the border and what is traded and what can't be traded and the impacts that these decisions have on people's lives in the borderlands. So you might wonder a little bit why the World Bank is interested in this, and I must admit, for me it's quite new as well. So I would say for me, working in Somalia now, it's obviously very, very, very relevant for several reasons. One is, I think, the shift that we would like to see in Somalia from purely humanitarian aid to more development-oriented aid. And that obviously have an impact, as we saw from Farah's research, in terms of people moving back and forth and where they're able to find livelihoods, where they're able to find basic services. And the idea is really, if we're able to provide more development assistance in a better organized way, the people would not have to resort to these movements, or perhaps they would be different in any case. So that is number one, and again, that's very much how we have worked how we're trying to work in Somalia along the humanitarian peace development nexus. The second reason I would say is the World Bank's push in the last few years to work more in FCV countries, so in countries affected by fragility and conflict. So 5 years ago, perhaps, we were not very eager to get into countries that are in active conflict or countries that are very, very fragile. And we tended also to leave as soon as there was an issue, and the result was very much a stop and go dialogue with the government and interventions and infrastructure support and all of that. So now there's much more a sense that we should stay engaged as long as we can. Obviously, if there are major issues impacting notably security in certain areas, it's difficult to go there. But we tend to try to find partners, UN agencies and NGOs to work with to be able to provide financing support to countries in active conflict like Somalia. So this, of course, is not easy, and it complicates our lives and it complicates what we're trying to do. And that's precisely why this research today, I think, is really, really important, and to get this more contextual information and research and analysis that can really enable us to tackle some of the more complex development challenges in the border regions. And with these vulnerable populations. The third reason I would say why we are involved in these areas today is as also was mentioned by both presenters, is the youth and the women that are often the ones moving back and forth and trading and the potential, obviously, of youth going forward. we are focusing in Somalia more and more on working with girls, with adolescent girls, focusing both our health interventions and our education interventions on promoting girls and the well-being of girls and the empowerment of women. And that is, again, of course, very relevant with given how you have described the situation. So we did also in this context, we did a report which is very much consistent with what the researchers are talking about on thinking about development in the borderlands of the Horn of Africa. So Laura was part of this as well, and then there's a new report titled From Isolation to Integration, the Borderlands of the Horn of Africa. So building on the World Bank's regional initiative to support the Horn of Africa. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. The report argues that tackling development in the borderlands requires adopting an approach that is attentive to the historical, political, and economic context, the transboundary nature of risks, as well as resilience, the mobile, gendered, and transboundary livelihoods and borderlands communities, and the formal and informal institutions of governance and local innovation. So again, these two reports are really, really relevant to that to this initiative. So maybe just again to say a few words about how we work in Somalia and Kenya on these issues. I saw that Laura just posted this report. Thank you, Laura. So in Somalia, again, we are engaging. We started engaging actually in 2012. And since then, we have slowly built up our interventions and our portfolio. Started very much working again on the humanitarian sphere and very much with UN agencies. And slowly and progressively trying to build the basic systems to allow development aid to be channeled through the government. So we are focusing on two main areas. One is building institutions and strengthening governance to deliver services, including health and education. And the second one is restoring resilience opportunities, both in rural and urban areas. And again, across these two themes, we use what we call a fragility lens and fragility filters. And we try as much as possible to make sure that the intervention address the sources of fragility and the reasons of fragility. And again, also with a very strong focus on women and girls. So one example is an education program where we are focusing to boost girls' enrollment and retention in schools. And this is what I mentioned before, which involves a lot of work with adolescent girls, recruit female teachers and health workers, provide safe and accessible learning facilities, and strengthen health systems for women and girls. Another example is an innovative financing facility called Gargara, which is expanding access for micro, small, and medium enterprises with a special focus on women-owned businesses. Trade, as Ngala was mentioned, is also an increasingly important area. And we have recently started working more on both formal and informal trade in Somalia and in the border regions. This, of course, it focuses mainly on the border between Ethiopia and Somalia. And it analyzes trade flows, facilitation, and integration. On the formal side, of course, it has an angle of making sure Somalia is integrated with the African continental free trade area, and also Somalia's aspiration to apply to the WTO. We also believe that digital services can foster trade and provide channels for facilitating cash transfers to vulnerable households. In partnership with the IFC, we have helped establish an independent telecoms regulator in Somalia and boost competitive industry regulation, as well as robust mobile money regulatory framework. And if I mean that would be a topic in my mind for research going forward, to see how the digital mobile money systems are really transforming and the societies, and I'm sure it has an implication for how the cross-border trade is conducted as well. So again, that would be very fascinating, I would think. On the Kenya side, the bank and Danida are supporting the socio-economic needs of Garissa and Turkana, while supporting long-term development solutions for Kenya's refugees population. There is an investment project there called Kenya Development Response and Displacement Impact Project. And it covers actually both, it's part of a regional project which also covers Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Uganda. And it aims to improve access to basic services, expand economic opportunities, and enhance environmental management for host communities of refugees. So this program has until now reached an estimated 350,000 almost beneficiaries. So we also work again along the borders to strengthen local government on both sides of the border. So in Kenya, we have a program called the Kenya Accountable Devolution Program, which has worked to strengthen both county and regional institutions, such as the Frontier County Development Council. And in Somalia, we're working with municipal governments through the Municipal Urban Resilience Project, which aims to improve basic infrastructure and services in 5 cities in Somalia, and which is very much involved the communities as well as IDPs in the cities in Somalia. Then finally, just to say a few words about our more regional engagement in the Horn of Africa. So overall, we're working very closely with the EU, and where we have this initiative on the Horn of Africa. So it's called the Horn of Africa Initiative, and where we are really focusing on 4 areas. One is regional infrastructure connectivity, which includes both energy and digital. The second one is promoting trade and economic integration. The third one is building resilience, and the fourth one is strengthening human capital development. So in many ways, again, the papers presented today cut across all these pillars, and again are very relevant to this Horn of Africa initiative. But they're particularly most relevant to the third pillar of building resilience, again with a strong focus on the borderland communities. We are also looking at a more specific borderland initiative in the Horn of Africa, and this would work with the objective to increase social cohesion across inclusive service delivery, expand electricity access, and improve cross-border energy transactions, groundwater management, and a shared resource, and improving the sub-regional livestock value chain. So this is again, before the World Bank also only worked in individual countries and not in FCV countries, and now we're going one step further to actually work on the borders in a regional way, and again in these very, very fragile environments. So we need all the support, all the research that we can get. And again, thank you so much to the presenters, and your research is very welcome. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kristina. You can see here that, as I said before, we're trying to hone in on borderlands, not as the edges of development or the edges of activity, but really as centers themselves that have their own dynamics and their own kind of sort of issues, whether mobility issues, development issues, et cetera, but really to sort of recenter our gaze in a sense in terms of humanitarian and development work in this respect. So I'm going to now open up the floor to any questions or anyone who wants to raise their hand to ask any of the speakers, or to ask a question that may be taken on by all. You can either raise your hand right away, or you can write your name in, or write a question into the chat. I see that Rufus Karanja's got a question already. Thanks, Rufus. Would you like to unmute and present your question yourself, or would you rather have me read it?
Thanks a lot, Dr. Laura. I think Rufus here from Embassy of Switzerland, and many thanks for this analysis. Maybe my question was directly to Farah, and it's in the chat box, and it's more or less just to understand whether with the refugee returnees who've come back to Dadaab, whether there's a broader trend to understand maybe which particular cities or towns they came from on the side of Somalia. Is more or less just to understand whether the study as it is, and apologies if you already mentioned it, if it indicated which specific towns or cities that they were, when you interviewed them, the returnees, whether they said which parts of Somalia they were coming from. Over.
Great. Farah, do you want to take that question now?
Sure. Thank you, Rufus. And I'd just like to highlight that a lot of participants in today's webinar were some of my key informants. So, thank you for always giving researchers time to provide your insights. And in terms of your questions about where they originated from, of the few returnees we spoke to, a few of them were born in Kenya or came when they were very young. So for them, Kenya was home. But I'll give you an example. One of the returnees said, who had spent about 25 years in Dadaab, and he said he was from a minority community in Somalia, and he'd never actually been there. But his choice of where to return to spontaneously in Somalia was Kismayo. So he returned to an area, that was not originally where his family was from, but was kind of determined by where he would find more livelihood opportunities. Another response would be that the data that we have from UNHCR and the data that's publicly available on who returned with assistance with the voluntary repatriation program, there's not a lot of disaggregated data. And one of our recommendations of this rapid review was to kind of do more research to understand, where are these returnees originally from in Somalia? Where do they live in Kenya? And when they return, do they return to those places in Kenya that they're from? So for example, some returnees, all of the 4 returnees who we interviewed had spent time in Dadaab before going back to Somalia, and they all chose to return back to Dadaab upon their return because of family and social ties. So I hope that gives you some indication about, areas of origin and decision-making about where to return in Somalia as well as back in Kenya.
I think I've unmuted you. Jeff, are you there?
I think you were muted, Laura.
Oh, was I muted? Oh, all right. Sorry. I was saying we have a second question from Jeff Crisp, which is also for Farah. And Jeff, are you able to unmute yourself? Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, is that working now?
Yeah, perfect. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, hi, Farah. I read a report a couple of years ago saying that many refugees living in Dadaab accumulate large amounts of debt. The only way they can pay off that debt is to accept the repatriation grant and to go back to Somalia. But that basically means that when they get back to Somalia, they don't have the repatriation grant to spend on their initial reintegration. And I just wondered whether that issue had come up as one of the reasons why people come back to Kenya.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks. That's a great question, and it indeed did come up in my research. So in the interviews that we did with returnees, we did learn that some return when their package ran out. There was a quote I shared in my presentation of a returnee who said that life in Kismayo was so expensive, and when the return package, which she used to pay for rent, water, etc., ran out, she came back to the camps. In our interviews with NGO respondents, there was one respondent who also noted that not everyone who opted for repatriation did so aiming for a permanent move. And he mentioned that some, take this package in order to pay off debts, and a lot of them are traders. So they use this package to clear their debts. Once that's done, any remaining funds are used to either start a business in Kenya, etc. So that theme did come up. And also, given that we did a literature review, REACH and NRC have done a lot of cross-border monitoring and return intention surveys. And in one of their assessments, their multi-sector needs assessment in Dadaab, I think Reach found that about 80% of households that they interviewed were indebted to traders, family, or friends. So I think this is an issue that warrants attention, and it is a factor at play with circular returns.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Farah. There's a message from Sam Clark, who's with the World Bank for Ngala. Sam, are you able to unmute yourself?
Sure, happy to. Thanks. Let me also congratulate the presenters. I really enjoyed reading these papers, very rich. I think it highlighted to me how much more I need to learn about these complex, institutional, social, institutional places. So my question was towards Ngala. It's to do with these innovative informal institutional arrangements that you mentioned and that you uncovered in your research. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how stable or unstable they are. To what extent is access changing on a regular basis, and therefore introducing an additional risk into the livelihoods of those living on the communities? Is it sort of like a daily change? Is it someone's not going to know whether they can cross day to day, or is it sort of like week to week that these things change and access opens up, closes down, or is it sort of over longer periods of time? So I'm just kind of interested in those, how sort of stable those informal institutional arrangements are, and if they are changing a lot, what are the main drivers of those fluctuations? Thanks.
Perfect. And I'm going to, so Ngala, can you hang on to that question? Because I want to, now they're coming in a little bit faster and I want to make sure we get enough to cover. So I'm going to also ask Nicoletta, do you want to present your question for Kristina?
Thank you. Yes, I was just trying to understand a bit better because Kristina, you closed the intervention indicating this. I didn't understand if it was intention, a plan, or already something ongoing about the work of the World Bank on the specific borderlands area. And I was also wondering actually how, because I saw in working borderland area, how many the non-existence of really cross-border formal institution. And so a lot of programs are delivered through government structures, and they run in parallel or sometimes even diverge. Anyway, there is not really a system to keep them linked across the border. So I was trying to understand what was the mechanism envisaged. Over.
Okay, perfect. Should we take those two and then we'll come to Mateo's question next? So Ngala and Kristina, can you respond to each of the questions given to you? You want to go first, Ngala?
Yeah, I can start with the
okay.
Actually answer class because more directly given to my presentation. How frequent are these arrangements changing? It depends with the sphere of activity in which they regulate. So, for example, you find that first and foremost, arrangements between Ethiopian officials and Kenyan officials on the Kenya-Ethiopia border are much more stable, and some are actually have been formalized by sort of security pacts that were signed in the 70s between the Kenyan and the Ethiopian government. These are still in operation, and some have even been supported by donor organizations, especially USAID. So when it comes to peace pacts, for example, Ethiopia is interested in taming the influence not only of Al-Shabaab in the area, but also of the Oromo National Liberation Front, and in that sense, the Ethiopian government and the Kenyan government have common interests. So when it comes to security and peace, you find that those arrangements are actually much more stable. And in another area where arrangements are actually much more stable, but in this case driven especially by influential local business people, is in the operation of livestock trade. So, for example, the sharing of abattoirs, fattening centers, especially in Mandera, from livestock that's coming from Somalia and Ethiopia. Those kind of arrangements are also much more stable. The drivers of instability, if you like, when it comes to these arrangements, it's usually sort of like wider security conflict dynamics. So, for example, as you know, right now, with the ongoing diplomatic spat between Kenya and Somalia, driven by events that actually are taking place in Mandera, these are the kind of wider kind of political dynamics that usually affect the stability of some of these arrangements. And usually, it's the powerless, small scale, particularly women traders who get affected the most while trying to cross the border to trade in especially small scale household goods. And it is usually these individuals, people who trade in very, very small scale items, that are subjected to bribery and to violence at the hands of border guards.
Great, thank you so much, Ngala. Kristina, would you like to speak to that question of how much of what you've been talking about is going on now, or is it projected?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for those questions, Nicoletta. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of this is in very early stages of planning and kind of conceptualization. So there is, we have done quite a lot of analytical work. One of the pieces being the one that was posted by Laura. And we are now getting started to see how we can implement what we're proposing. And like you say, it's a tricky thing because obviously we're dependent also on the kind of political harmony in the relative political harmony in the region, because we have to have the different countries assigned to this and agree to this. And it was easier 2 years ago when the Horn of Africa was a little bit more of a what should we say? Not a stable region, but a more harmony region than compared to what it is today, with the different fractions and tensions in the region today. So we are looking obviously to work. It depends a little bit on the issue. So on the groundwater, for example, it's very much a collaboration between the different governments, right? On the electricity, it also involves regional organization. So there's a regional a regional energy commission or something like that, where the countries already have an established relationship with each other. On the more social and kind of the social cohesion components, I would ask if Sam can comment on that, on who we actually would work with, because again, on these border communities and so on, it would be good to hear from you, Sam, if you can talk a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Sure. So I think,
yeah, go Sam.
Yeah. Okay. Let me jump in quickly. I think as Kristina mentioned, I think this is at a relatively early stage of conceptualization, this borderlands operation. One of the tricky things is for a regional operation is we require 3 countries to come on board. And I think that one of the first things that we're planning to do is have a series of country level dissemination workshops for the report as a next step, to go into a bit more detail. We did the overall launch, I think, which was very well received. But now we want to sort of start discussing with the different stakeholders about how would we actually operationalize this and take forward like the key findings of the report. And I think that it's those type of questions about who we would work through what kind of agencies, et cetera, that we will work through. I mean, we do have, we do primarily work through the government, so that does give us some limitations. I mean, I think one of the things I know a little bit less about on the Somalia side, but I think what's really key, certainly on the Kenya side, and it came through, I think, in Ngala, I think both the reports, is just how important the local governments are to working with these communities and managing these dynamics across the borders, providing services. So I think any any kind of initiative that we would be doing and any kind of work we would be doing with like the types of informal institutions that Ngala mentioned, as well as any kind of additional work with displaced people that went beyond perhaps sort of immediate host communities and refugees. A lot of that I think we would have to be doing in very close collaboration with counties. And in kind of context like Kenya, but also in Ethiopia, there is quite robust local governments that we could work through on these type of issues. Yeah, let me stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Sam. Matteo, you have a question. Matteo Peltrioni? Are you there still, Matteo? Yeah.
Yes.
Please.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Actually, I put it in the chat box.
Yeah, it's fine. I just wanted, sometimes people, it becomes clear when they present it themselves.
Yeah. I've seen today on the news that Ethiopia and the government of Kenya are strengthening their relation at the border in terms of, to monitor the situation of the border or to further enhance the coordination. I was wondering if this would ever happen between Kenya and Somalia, and this is particularly in reason of what we are discussing today in terms of closure of the refugee camps. That's it.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Yeah, we could. So I think probably there might be more than one panelist who could speak to that. Maybe I could throw in a question as well here, if that's all right. So just references made a couple of times to the World Bank report, which I contributed to. And one of the things we were trying to do in that report was to sort of decenter the conversation around states and how states function, and to say, let's look at the peripheries of states, not just as edges of governance, but as spaces unto themselves. And so what Sam was just talking about really working with counties, I think resonates very well with that kind of analysis. But one of the things we find, for instance, is that, if you look at livelihoods and what livelihood mapping, the kind of work that FuseNet does, for instance, it goes up to national borders and it ends right at the international boundary, and it isn't very often connected up with other dynamics on the other side. So I guess it's a question. The question that I have is whether or not in the research that you've been doing and in the programming that the bank's been doing, if you find examples of ways in which somehow either directly or inadvertently perhaps our development kind of frameworks are making that joined up approach towards borderlands more difficult. Because I think in a lot of the work that the REF has been doing, we find that it's not necessarily a direct intention of development work, but it's an unintended consequence that that people who rely on being able to cross borders or on their livelihoods being able to draw from the resources that exist on both sides of a border sometimes lose out by development policies and sometimes by refugee assistance policies that sort of insist almost that they be in one location and that don't really adapt well to people's mobility. So it's about whether or not people have found that in their own work. I mean, a clear example, I guess, is Farah was giving the example that if you're part of the assisted return process from Dadaab, you surrender your refugee registration card, and then if you return from Somalia back to Kenya, then you are unregistered. So that's an example of a place in which an so-called assistance policy kind of reinforces this idea of you must pick one location and stay in it, rather than understanding the highly fluid nature of many people's lives in this part of the world. So there's a question, so there's kind of two bits there from Matteo and myself. Who wants to take on either of those?
I think I'll jump into Matteo's question. On the news today between local Kenyan officials, and I think it has to be emphasized that these officials that I've mentioned in that media report are local politicians and local administrators, and sort of local their counterparts in Ethiopia. It's not surprising that they agree on this kind of security arrangements. This has always been the case, and it always seems easier or more possible for Kenyan and Ethiopian officials to agree on kind of peace pacts and security arrangements on that border compared to of course, Kenya, Somalia. Now, I think the current political situation now will make it highly unlikely that Kenyan and Somali officials across the border will come to certain kind of arrangement around security, given especially the nature of or the ongoing spat between Kenya and Somalia around the Janan forces in Gedo region, and the fact that the Kenyan government has taken a particular position when it comes to the future of the future direction of Somali politics that the current regime in Somalia does not really align with. So given those kind of wider political disputes between Kenya and Somalia, it makes it very difficult for local administrators and clan elders to work out local security arrangements across the Kenya-Somalia border than it is the case with the Kenya-Ethiopia border. I think that's what I'll say. And for Laura's point, yes, I think my paper and Farah's paper all emphasize the importance of the border to local residents, and in particular the importance of being able to cross the border frequently and much more easily. It's very, very important to the livelihoods of local residents. And I think that governments, international non-governmental organizations, even local non-governmental organizations need to come to terms with the fact of cross-border livelihoods rather than kind of livelihoods that are sort of limited by national boundaries. Yeah.
Great. Anyone else want to respond to either of those questions, Kristina?
Yeah, maybe I can just come in. I mean, to say that it is definitely a challenge, I think, for this shift to focus on borderland communities per se, and accepting this mobility right back and forth. So it's a challenge for us, as we are used to working with one national government, right, and having an agreement with one national government, and focusing on borderland communities means that they then have to prioritize that over another intervention that they could do with stable communities in another part of the country, right? So this has to be a priority. But I do think that the discourse is changing, and I think that I think that we're learning really to both to talk about and to accept these communities for what they are, and that we need to focus on them and need to encourage the governments to focus on it. So again, there are a lot of challenges, I think, but I think that we are the whole discussion around fragility, and then again moving to borders, focusing on trade and all these issues. So far, I think we've done it mainly on analytical level, but again, we are eager to see how we can support the vulnerable populations in these cross-border areas. So it's learning, yeah, but it's not easy.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we have just a comment, I think, from Nicoletta, which maybe I'll read in the interest of time, which is, she just reminds us that it's maybe worth remembering that the situation was very different just a few years ago between Kenya and Somalia in the Mandera Triangle, with coordination about security and livestock issues. Certainly the political realities that go on between different countries, particularly at the sort of central level, has gone through ebbs and flows of frostiness and warmth. And I guess what's quite, kind of interesting in a way is that perhaps the livelihoods of people who live along those borders are less volatile. They tend to be, they have their ways of people rely on different resources on either sides of the border, and that reliance and that mutual exploitation of resources carries on regardless of what's happening between Nairobi and Mogadishu, or Addis Ababa and Nairobi. And that's, I think, where these papers become really useful and interesting and important. And, as Kristina says, we have a lot to learn, but I think these kind of deep dives into what is happening at the local level within communities is a good starting point to try to unpack how best to have development policies and programs that support rather than undermine the resilience that goes on at the border. Certainly there are vulnerabilities among these communities, but there are also incredible forms of resilience, and borders do represent a source of resilience in many cases when they can be used, when people are able to use them. So hopefully in that spirit, some of this research and the new kinds of programming that's coming out from the World Bank and from others can help to really facilitate it. I think a real quite significant and important change with respect to engaging with borders and engaging indeed more broadly with mobility within the region. We're just about out of time, so I wanted to thank everyone, thank our speakers for joining us. Please do, you see the links to all the reports we've been talking about, which are in the chat. And we'll be doing more borderland research in the remaining period for the REF. So watch this space, and we hope that we'll be able to re-engage in other kinds of constellations and gatherings in the coming months. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura.
Take care. Thanks very much.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank
bye.
you. Bye.